I hope you all had a wonderful, relaxing one, and thanks for coming. I know it can be tough to get back in the swing like this, but there's no better way to do it than with our distinguished guest for today, Professor Ryan Calo, who needs no introduction, of course, but I'll give one nevertheless. So Professor Calo, if you're not familiar, is from the University of Washington. He is the Lane Powell and D. Wayne Gittinger Associate Professor. I'm always curious, do you actually get to meet some of these people?
I met Wayne Gittinger's wife.
Good. Well, see, that's nice.
Yeah.
Make a bit of a personal connection.
Lovely, yeah.
Good. At the Washington School of Law, he's also a faculty co-director, this is really cool, of the University of Washington Tech Policy Lab, which is a really interdisciplinary lab of the kind we're trying to create here at IU as well, so that might foster some interesting dialogue on top of Ryan's fantastic research here. That spans the law school and computer science and other disciplines. Professor Calo's research on law and emerging technology appears in a number of law reviews, California, University of Chicago, Columbia, has technical publications from MIT Press, among others. He's really prolific on mainstream media. You might have heard him on NPR before or seen him in the New York Times, and has testified before the full Judiciary and Commerce Committees, as well as the German Parliament. You get around, right? To say the least. Done a lot of interesting stuff. Business Insider, for one, has named him the most influential, one of the most influential people in robotics. So today, Professor Calo is going to be talking about his new book that I understand now you get to work on a little bit during sabbatical next year, which is going to be just fantastic, called Rules for Artifacts, Law and Technology and Theory in Practice. So, per usual, we'll do a few minutes of teeing up with Professor Calo here, then we'll go around. So, thank you so much again for being here, and welcome any remarks you might have.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for hosting me. It's
absolutely.
an incredible honor to be here at the Ostrom Workshop. Just hearing a little bit about the history of the Ostroms and learning how this building and this group came to be. It's awe-inspiring, right? To be able to participate. I understand it's been around since the 1970s, and it's a fabulous thing. So I'm really happy to be able to be here. So I'm the reason I have my laptop open is actually not to read you a spiel, but I'm going to be taking detailed notes. The truth is that I am really early days with this project. I have been thinking about law and technology for about a decade, primarily in the areas of privacy and increasingly in robotics and artificial intelligence. One of the best things I've learned here at IU so far has been that you call your research assistants AIs, which is absolutely terrific, and I'm going to be bringing that back to University of Washington. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do at this phase in the book project is I'm trying to figure out what would amount to a satisfactory law and technology methodology. In other words, what would the qualities be where you wouldn't pick this thing up and say, what is this guy? This is missing an entire dimension over here. Why hasn't he read so and so, and that kind of thing. So I'm in this phase where I'm just trying to build out a robust methodology so that I can put something credible forward for my community and our community to shoot at. In other words, so my only thesis at this stage of the project is that this is a worthwhile endeavor. It's a worthwhile endeavor because law and technology we've been writing about law and technology for a long time, but there's no common methodology, no common set of methods, at least not expressed. Maybe there are certain tacit commonalities. And I think that's really doing us a disservice. One of the ways to see that is that each law and technology project feels sui generis and doesn't seem to be building or drawing upon any previous method. So someone will say, I'm going to write about augmented reality in contracts. And then that gets presented and so on. And someone else is going to say, I'm going to write about artificial intelligence and privacy. And that, and these things all exist on their own. And they're not unified by any common approach, by any express set of commitments, and so on. So my only thesis at this stage is that it is worthwhile to think through what would it look like to have a thick methodology and a concrete set of methods by which to interrogate any given intersection between technology and the law. So presumably I will be drawing from science technology studies, which I'm not yet terribly well versed. The reason I have the perspective, I think, to write this book is because I have seen so much law and technology scholarship, and I sit on program committees of many different conferences, and so year after year I see this stuff, and it's great work. I mean, it's really moving the ball forward. It's very, very exciting work year after year. But what I see is that we are, in many ways, kind of fighting fire without a theory of firefighting. And so, I do feel convinced that that there's room for a book like this. But what I need, and what I've been doing, has been going to different interdisciplinary and single-disciplinary faculties like these, and asking questions like, what would I need to answer? You know, what would make you feel like this was not a satisfactory project? What kinds of questions would I need to be asked? I may have some of my own preliminary thoughts, and I'm happy to share them with you to the extent you're interested, but I'm really interested in like, what would be satisfactory. I've been now to Stanford and Howard, and this is my third such conversation, and I'm just trying to get to a place where I feel confident in doing the reading and the initial writing. I think I'll just end there, honestly. I mean, so I should say, I do have certain views about questions that you might expect. Like, what is technology? Why is it important to, study it? What is law's relationship? I have all these views. They're developing. I have them, and if you want to ask me about them, I'm happy to share. But again, I'm really interested from my perspective in what does this book need to cover, and what would it be conspicuous were it not to cover?
Fantastic. Could I ask just one clarifying question up front? Is that okay? One thing that kind of just struck to me as being potentially a pivot point in the piece is you talk about, obviously, technology's impact on law and law's impact on technology, both. And I'm wondering, does your interest lie more in one of those domains than the other, or are you going to try to cover the whole gambit in this piece? Because that seems to be, a whole separate, set of case studies and narratives and kind of approaches in both of those veins, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's a big, those are both really meaty questions. I'm just kind of wondering which direction you see heading more, because that could help influence our discussion a little bit.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk through that very briefly. So there's an initial scoping issue here, which is, if you think about law and technology.
And then, of course, as Ryan, please feel free to signal, and I'll start keeping.
If you think about law and technology writ large, you could be thinking about any number of things. You could be thinking, for example, on how does technology affect the practice of law, like literally what lawyers and judges and governors do, policymakers do. So I think there of like Muriel Hildebrandt's work on smart technology ends of law, or I think of all the certain, like all the conversations about whether judges can be, AI and things like that. But you might also think about what is the role of what is the role of law in channeling technology in the public interest? And there you might go back to like Lawrence Tribe, channeling technology through law. You can look at some of the technology assessment work coming out of ASU and other corridors and so on. And then there's probably even another bucket which has to do with innovation, right? And so the question about to what extent, what is law's role in fostering innovation? You might look at Lisa Olet's work and others at Stanford and elsewhere. So I mean, there's a lot of possibilities. The thing I'm primarily interested in is, imagine you're a new scholar, a student, maybe you're a staffer on the Hill, and you suspect that some new technology, augmented reality, for example, artificial intelligence, will have some kind of societal impact that law needs to manage. You know what I mean? Some artifact, a driverless car, a drone, has been introduced into the world.
Okay. Yep.
And you need to manage its complex interactions. So it's truly that area that I'm most interested in. But I plan to do a lot of scoping in the book to acknowledge that there's a lot of other facets of law technology. That's what I'm primarily focused on.
No, that's really helpful. Yep. Okay. Perfect. Great. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Well, that last comment you just made. Staff are thinking about how do law and technology, how they influence each other. I think it's each other. That helps me. As I read, I said, boy, this is this book's going to be 2,000 pages long,
Yeah.
and that narrows it down, and it's almost like that's a statement you need to make early in this because it helps narrow the focus rather than this broad array of everything. So I would really strongly suggest that you figure out how to put that in your opening phrase, because I think that helps define where you're headed.
That makes sense. I mean, a part of me wants to come up with some grand unified theory of law and technology.
I think you got to take a piece out of it and not try to,
and not try to do the whole
Now
thing.
you may do a series of books.
That's right.
Right.
So I
Encyclopedia
would just
Galactica.
jump on that.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say too, if you wanted to introduce yourselves to Ryan, that's fine too. To let you know.
I'm Bernie Fisher. I'm a professor over at SPIA, School of Public Environmental Affairs.
Great.
Thanks, Bernie.
I tell you, with environmental, so one of the things I've been doing in trying to scope this work has been looking at within law, typically, other navel-gazing by other subfields of law. And so what you see is, these like symposia about what is animal law, what are its contours, you know what I mean, health law, and environmental law is one of the ones that has been the most sustained sort of look at what it is and what it means, and even acknowledging some changes over time. And so, there's relatively little of that with respect to law and technology, although there is some. And people come up with idiosyncratic differences about what law and technology is. But to me, I gravitate towards this idea of there's new technologies. They present as though they are somehow fixed. You get a driverless car. It's this artifact. But in fact, when you begin to unpack it, it's actually it's a set of techniques and affordances that when you unpack it, you actually get a wiser, you can sort of better understand the relationship of society and law to these things when you start to unpack them, but they get presented like an art. So I'm interested in the introduction of new technology and its consequences for society and the role of law in managing.
Absolutely. I think I saw your hand next, and we'll.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a question, but maybe more of a comment.
Please.
My name's Iris Cole. I'm just a grad student in SICE.
Not just.
Yeah. You're my audience.
Well, it's just kind of the way that law and technology are being talked about here is two black boxes thinking of each other as not black boxes. And, in your inquiry towards a methodology for lawyers or scholars, it seems like you kind of need to take a stand on which black box you're going to keep closed in order to interrogate the other.
You don't think it's feasible to de-black box them both?
I think that both rely on different socio-technical imaginaries about what they are and then how they operate. I'm helping a student right now, an undergraduate, work on a case about how predictive policing technologies should be dealt with in the criminal justice system. And some of the most productive conversations that she and I have had has been about like how different people fundamentally understand technology differently, and that informs the way the law seems to develop, right? And she wants to make this larger argument that precedent doesn't necessarily need to determine how certain surveillance technologies are treated today, right? Just because something's been happening since 9/11 doesn't mean that it should. She's making an ethics-based argument. Again, cooking up her own methodology for how to do this, because it doesn't really seem to exist. But in those conversations, there's imaginaries about what the law is doing and what it wants to accomplish, and what police officers think their technologies are. And in the contemporary conversation, when we talk about technology, we're usually talking about digital computers. We're not talking about pens and paper, right, or maps, or police officers themselves as technologies. And so somehow it becomes about people who don't have problems themselves using these problematic things rather than both being problematic and then they're working together to do a thing. You know what I mean?
I do. So, I think that one of the tensions that I see, just to dive right into this, one of the tensions I see in my own community is that there seems to be a tension between getting it right and being able to act upon it. So for example, a good example of this is the work of Julie Cohen at Georgetown. Julie's work is magnificent. I mean, it's just incredible how well she develops her theories about the role of technology in society in shaping the self. You know what I mean? There's these really thick conceptions that you can sort of quibble and wonder why she's elevating the capability of play, over other capabilities. But you see this with really thick conception, and the beauty of her work is that she recognizes what you're saying, and she recognizes that these are embedded social technical systems, and social technical systems, and people will have different ways of thinking about them, and in fact, the very way that we're constituted is influenced by it's just a sort of thick, deep conception.
Thick description.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
she gets it right, right? The problem then is that in the last third of her book, where she pivots to what we should do about it, all of a sudden we're told that we should just go back to this basic Phipps understanding of fairness, and so on, and the practical prescriptions seem to map on not at all to the roughly postmodern analysis that has preceded it. And so one of the tensions, I think, with this project is going to be how do you make this intellectually satisfying while at the same time having a policy, that I want it to be beautiful music, but I want you to be able to dance to it. And I worry a little bit about trying to get it completely right.
I see this in anthropological works all the time.
Yeah.
Where there's like a situated case study and it's beautifully done, and you get a good description of what happened and maybe what's happening. But then projections towards the future rely on a completely different paradigmatic thinking about what the work is capable of supporting, right? As evidence, right? So in that case, it's about generalizability and universalizing your findings from your work. And as far as I know, there's people who just think you shouldn't do it, and some people who think that you should, right? In terms of universalizing your findings, right?
So let me give you a concrete example that I'm sort of thinking about recently that involves imagining. So one of the things my lab is looking at right now is robotic delivery. The idea that stuff would be delivered to your house by a robot. And what is astonishing is that there's a bunch of these robot delivery companies that have these land-based little carts that go around. And then there's also a number of efforts to do drone delivery, and so on. And what is popping up is that these companies have gone to state lawmakers and or cities and gotten them to pass laws that map on pretty cleanly to what they're doing. So it can be 80 kilograms, it has to stay on the sidewalk on the crosswalk, it has to have this kinds of things and so on. Part of the reason that is at all possible is that these lawmakers are not thinking about what made this technology feasible and possible, both from a business perspective and a social expectation perspective, and also what the underlying constituent technologies are. I've seen this also with driverless cars and with many other things. My hope would be to present them with a set of steps, okay, in which they could think clearly and expansively about both what is the technology, is it new, where does it come from, is it contingent or is it inevitable, what are the other possible configurations, right? And to think through that in a systematic way. And then also further to think about what it changes about human affordances, with particular attention to non-mainstream or vulnerable groups and so on. So it's just, and then finally to do a systematic assessment then of what I call an ends-affordance approach, for lack of a better term for the moment, but asking what are the societal stated policy goals and values and how can this technology interfere with them, or actually potentially further them, right? Now, along the way, I want to be sensitive to avoid technological determinism, to understand that the way that people imagine and think about technology has an effect on important questions like when to intercede, whether you do it up front as a matter of prevention or a precautionary principle, or whether you allow for permissionless innovation on the other end, and all these things. But I don't think I have the training or you know what I mean, or the goal of de-black boxing both robotics and the law for the full purpose of explaining in academically perfect detail what is going on with that, right? And so it's a tension, though. I mean, I absolutely understand what you're asking me, and I'm trying to think of how to navigate that tension.
Have you read Sheila Jasanoff's Ethics of Invention?
I have not, but her name has come up repeatedly. She's at the Harvard Kennedy School. And,
she foregrounds the thinking of unintended consequences as a way of organizing this systematic way of thinking about the development of
a precautionary principle.
Yeah, right. So you just, if you're trying to think about what to maximize, it would then be minimizing harm for the people who may be disproportionately affected by innovation.
Absolutely, and I think that's a very good organizing principle, and I think probably we would see that it's a pretty common commitment across law and technology, both scholarship and practice. I think doing a deep dive into her work is absolutely critical.
And
thank you for coming, first of all.
Sure, yeah.
My question is a little more specific. I am a history graduate student, so I picked up on the trains portion, which I found interesting. I guess my question really is, generally, why trains do you think, why you think that's an interesting, good analog for modern technologies? And does that analog fail at some point? I mean, if you're describing systematic approaches to robotic delivery, you mentioned some wise policy decisions that lawmakers made about trains. Were they very systematic about it? I'm not a train historian specifically, so I defer to you. But do you see promise in mining how we dealt with trains, laws we made to deal with them, and maybe things that can show us the way?
That's a great question, and so obviously I am even further than you as a historian of trains. And what I will tell you is that I teach tort law, and the prevailing, and I've read a couple of books on the influence of trains on American law. Well, typically it is depicted as though it was one-sided. I want to use trains, and I want to use nuclear power, and I want to use a couple other things. As both as case studies to see whether or not you could apply the method to assess whether we were adequate about for example, trains, but also as precautionary. So, for example, one of the animating questions for me has been something along the lines of, like, how is it possible? How is it even possible that we proceeded in the United States to go forward with nuclear energy without a plan to dispose of waste? Do you know what I mean? If you go back and look at it, like, there are literally conversations where people will be like, well, it looks like this would create a lot of horrible nuclear waste, and what are you going to do with it? And the answers were things like, at least the answers in the 50s, were things like, come on, we split the atom. You know what I mean? We can't dispose of some waste. And it wasn't until like the 80s, when with the Nuclear Waste Act and so on, that we started to actually think systematically about how to deal with this, right? So we have certain examples like that, which were clear misses and clear problems, and one wonders whether a more systemic approach to assessment would have been done work there, versus trains, which, trains have any number of deep social and political and economic impacts on the United States, some of which disproportionately inure very much the detriment of particular populations. But one thing I do know about is the way that the law responded to mediate the utility of trains with their capacity and likelihood to do harm. Because trains were like amazing, I mean, people like people like all of a sudden like could go from place to place in journeys that they used to die, trying to do. You know what I mean? And they connected places and they changed our conceptions of time and all kinds of other stuff. But they killed a lot of people, both on the train. People were hit with trains. Killed a lot of cows in particular. They just did a lot of damage, right? And so the law, to anthropomorphize a moment, the law sort of struggled with how do we mediate this utility with acknowledging that there needs to be some kind of liability, and cast about and found a little backwater, which was at the time negligence law. So what's interesting about that story is that negligence law was really brought to bear on, it existed, it was in maritime law and elsewhere, but it just was not a big deal. Negligence law was brought in to try to mediate this tension with trains. And then, subsequently, not only did it do a reasonably good job, a lot of people would disagree, but also negligence has now become an incredibly important force and a tool, to do all kinds of things. So what I like about the story about the train is it acknowledges both that the law, again, the law is not some person that can think for itself, but the legal community responded with a particular doctrine that worked reasonably well. But then that technology became a catalyst for, became a point to showcase how a particular technique of law would be very useful. And I see that time and again. I see it with potentially artificial intelligence. I see it with, if you want to use historical examples, the vaccine, the need to disseminate smallpox vaccine was one of the catalysts for the administrative state, because all of a sudden the government had to figure out a way to get, lots of, so I mean, I'm really interested in that component. So that's why trains. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we had a, okay, if you want to go ahead, James. All right, right after you, I'll do a question we just got from the internet. So,
oh, interesting. I'm sorry, I'm really ignorant on these topics, but it makes me, your use of the idea of trains makes me question how these issues will differ based on like federal rights or federal laws versus state laws and rights, and because the one train example that I know of was in, it explained the difference in Virginia and West Virginia. And a farmer sued a rail company in Virginia saying that the train should have stopped because the cow was ringing her bell while on the track, and the farmer won. And it went along this, the argument, the legal argument was the power of the landowners in the Commonwealth of Virginia, as opposed to West Virginia, which was mainly settled because of the rail industry to extract natural resources. And so how then the industry that gave way to like industry having more power over the people and whatnot in West Virginia. So sort of getting to the point here, I'm wondering how do you think this is going to play out in sort of the states creating laws and the federal government creating laws and sort of that sort of push and pull and wanting of the control over the technology, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
It does, and I think it's going to be important to acknowledge in a system like ours a few things. One is that different areas of the law might have dramatically different responses to the same perceived problem. You know what I mean? Liability for a chattel versus property ownership rights are pretty dramatically different.
Yeah.
And then, again, in a system like ours, where jurisdictions don't have to respect one another, you can have even very different areas. So what I'm trying to develop with this project, this is helping me see how concrete I need to be about that, is for any given jurisdiction that wishes to react to technology, how can it do it in a systematic way? So for example, you're a rural jurisdiction in West Virginia. You have just learned that there's going to be a train coming through. You know what I mean? Rather than just place a bunch of panicky phone calls to different people where you ask about trains and you ask about, you know what I mean? You sit down and think, okay, what are the new affordances of trains? What do they allow? What do they cut off? What are the what are the dangers and so on? And you more systematically develop views of what goals you're trying to achieve, and how these new technologies interfere with those goals or make them possible in another way. And with trains, I'm not as familiar with the context of trains. I mean, what I know about trains is all about conversations I've heard about the effect of trains on tort law, because I've read a couple books on that. But I will say that, for example, with artificial intelligence, as used by the courts, that's not being done. And the consequence is that not only are jurisdictions doing different things and having different reactions, but they are not usually the wisest ones. And I would hope that a book like this would allow a court system thinking about artificial intelligence to think about what artificial intelligence how it will pose challenges for what courts do, how it might interfere, for example, with the ability to interrogate decisions by courts as a matter of due process, for example. But also, how might technology begin to deliver on values and promises that the law makes, but because of technological and other limitations, resource limitations, it's unable to do. So, for example, access to the courts. How would you give people for whom, or a speedy trial, which we guarantee, but we don't even look into it until a year passes before you have had a trial. So the idea then is to try to, the idea of the method as I'm trying to develop it is really about being systemic about what the affordances of technology are, and the goals and ends of the law, and then what the levers might be. And what I guess in response to your question, you could do that if you're a city. We've helped cities we've helped the city of Seattle think about what to do about driverless cars. You could do that if you're a nation. We hosted the Obama administration's inaugural workshop around what to do, how to set artificial intelligence policy. You could do that if you're an individual agency, if you're a state, and so on. So the hope would be to do this method at a level of generality that it would help structure anyone's thinking who was a policymaker or a student, or you know what I mean? Whether that's achievable in fact is yet to be seen.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's one of the tensions. It's like, so who's your audience? And if the answer is everybody, how are you going to write something that is useful to everyone?
It's really interesting.
Yeah, accessible and meaty.
Thanks.
So we got a question from Mike Madison from University of Pittsburgh. That just kind of came in.
Mike,
so exactly. So it'll take me about 30 seconds to read it. So
sure,
apologies. And if others want to jump in, just let me know. So the question from Mike is, how does Ryan's project differ from, say, Yokai's work about democratic governance, or Julie Cohen's work, as was mentioned, about liberal political theory? He says, because STS stuff often takes the liberal premise, focus on the agency of the individual actor, like Rawls, for granted, and problematizes that. One might say that instead, that in different respects, modern technology undermines a lot of liberal theory. He says Brett Frischman's recent book doesn't say that directly, but it gets close, yet Brett doesn't have a theory of what happens next, which might be a gap this could help fill. A different way to put this is, in what respect is this a project about tech, and in what respect is it a project about liberal theory?
Yeah, well, that's a terrific question, and it doesn't surprise me at all. Given Yeah, I mean, so Brett Frischman's book with Evan Selinger, who is a philosopher of technology, is interesting book because it's about this interplay between technology and what it is to be a person. Yeah. And like Julie Cohen's book, and like some of Benkler's Yochai Benkler's work at where's Yochai at Harvard now, right? Yes, I mean, so the idea is that a lot of legal scholarship in general has this sort of this conception not only does it have a liberal theory backdrop, but it has this conception of the individual who has a set of preferences, and they're attempting to exercise them in the world, and so contract and consumer law and all these other things that reflect this conception. And recent work has looked to STS and postmodern theory and other lenses in order to problematize that, right? And I want to say that this is not really for me a project about that. I mean, I'm not trying to interrogate the ways in which we are socially constructed by technology, nor really to interrogate the ways in which technology itself is this contingent social construct. I want to be mindful of those things. I want to be sensitive to them, because I don't think you can really understand the likely impact of technology on society and human affordance. So for example, when I use words like affordances, which is also something that Julie has been using in her work and Mirelle Hildebrand have been using, now I'm talking about it like literally in the way that the perceptual psychologist Gibson talks about it, like the idea that your affordances are your ability, the way that you are able to perceive and interact with your environment. And what I like about affordances is that they recognize that the theory of affordances recognize a certain amount of subjectivity, which is that not everybody perceives the same aspects of the environment, nor do they have the capability of interacting with it the same way. He uses the example of animals, like a cliff affords danger to a dog, but not to a bird. A tree affords hiding to a squirrel, but not to a bear, right? But you can do the same exact thing with people in society. And so when you begin to talk about that, about this idea that there will be like an individual and he or she will have a set of affordances that relate to their own capabilities and perception, you do, I would argue, adhere to a somewhat liberal conception, right? And so the project is not responsive to that. It's not responsive to that. And so maybe I should be very upfront about that. It's much more in the spirit of what would Lawrence Tribe's channeling technology through law from the 1970s look like today? And part of what it would look like would be that there's been a lot of things that have unfolded since the 1970s. Technology has changed dramatically. We understand it in different and new, and I would say, better, in some ways better ways. We have the benefit of STS and Law and Society, other things that were more inchoate at the time of his writing. But we also recognize the rather systemic ways in which technology and technology policy reflects mainstream thinking, the way that the engineers of technology tend to be of a particular, they look a certain way, they have a certain background, they have a certain set of assumptions. And I think it's important to problematize and interrogate that, but I'm not going to the core here. This is not a project about that. And indeed, I think when you start to do that, is when it becomes very, very difficult to translate your insights into actual pragmatic practice. And I get it. I could be getting it wrong. I could be oversimplifying. But, policymakers would be paralyzed, right? If they had to completely wholesale abandon some of these political liberal theory notions. You know what I mean? Now, I may have to do much more defense of that idea, but and people like Brett and Julie and others have criticized my work over the years as being too focused on these things. I've done a bunch of work on like behavioral economics and consumer law, and I think a lot of folks in the academy, they like it, they use it, they think it works. It's gotten traction with the FTC and so on. Others in the academy say, gosh, this is a way overly simplistic model of how humans behave.
Thank you for coming and presenting the inspiring project. I'm a student, a graduate student from health as well as science. My question is about the application part. So how will choose those cases in 3. And for me, like the train and nuclear right now really specific, but robotics and artificial intelligence is kind of like a huge umbrella. And how do you like organize those applications?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question, and I don't actually have a very good answer for you. So what I'm committed to with the project is, particularly when I presented this to the Stanford faculty, a couple pushed back very hard, and they said, "Look, how do we know whether your theory works?" You know what I mean? Like, okay, well, how does it improve? You say that it's an ad hoc world, and that we're losing out on all these insights because we are taking everything piecemeal. How does having a unifying, like, what does it actually improve? And so that really pushed me to say that I want to have an application component to the book where I apply the methodology and the methodology of part 1, the method of part 2, to part 3. And so I pretty arbitrarily picked a set of what I thought to be important technologies. But as I have yet even to fully develop either the methodology or method, it becomes very difficult to imagine what I ought to be applying it to. You know, so in a lot of different areas, as you all know, science, but say take machine learning. In machine learning as an academic discipline, you have these benchmarks. You know, how well does your system perform against X? You know, we don't quite have that. But so I'm trying to also sort of implicitly argue that perhaps there could be a set of benchmarks against which you could test your approach to law and technology. And it seems to me intuitively that nuclear power and trains and robots and a few other things would be among them. But I don't have a well-defended sense of why. And I particularly appreciate your question about some of these things are awfully specific, right? And other things are highly varied, you know. And I don't know quite yet what I think that's a bug or a feature, but at least it should be it should be thought of. But can I give you to respond? I mean, what is it? What do people think? What do you think? What do people think about testing this against a benchmark? Like, would you want to see someone bother to do that? Would that be important to you? If you read a book that you felt like laid out a set of epistemological and normative commitments in the first part, did a lot of scoping,
like a regime effectiveness study of some kind.
Yeah, like would it be like some kind of way to validate that the system improves upon,
like a no regime counterfactual, like without this regime being in place, this could have resulted in.
Right. I mean, what do you think about it?
So walk me through so walk me through the 3 sections. You were just going to start to do that, but
yeah. So and maybe I've done this before, but I mean, so basically the idea is that I'm drawing a distinction that some disciplines draw and some don't between methodology and method. Okay, so I'm saying that on the one hand, I want the first part of the book to answer questions like, what do you mean by technology? Why is technology as a social fact uniquely interesting to law? You know what I mean? And then if you pursue law and technology, if you believe you're in a discipline called law and technology, what kinds of epistemological and normative commitments do you have? These would be things like, I believe that the common goal of law and technology is to promote human flourishing of a particular kind. Or I believe that there's an importance to precedent, and that whatever outcomes need to fit, you know, in a kind of to work in sort of law's integrity, sort of whatever they happen to be, you know. Law is a very interestingly normative discipline versus others, right? And so I want to import that normative. What are sort of like your commitments as to knowing and as to normatively? And so the idea would be then that would be where I would answer questions, like very good questions about scope, right? What are you talking about here? Are you talking about innovation policy? Are you talking about, you know, channeling technology? So part 2 would like literally walk through a multi-stage process that you could follow if you wanted to write about a particular technology, or you wanted to educate about a particular technology, or you wanted to set policy. So it'd be a multi-step process. Part 3 would be a series of case studies, both contemporary and past, to which applying that set of steps would be fruitful.
Yeah, I mean, that's also how I read the proposal. So it's, I think I understand where you're going, and I would say yes. I'm not sure. I would question how many multiple cases you need to do that with, though.
Okay.
Right. So it could be a third section of the book. It could also just be a chapter or a detailed conclusion in which you said, let's take trains. Let's take nuclear energy or nuclear. Yeah. Maybe two. Maybe you want something that's more historical, something that's more contemporary. But then just say, right? I mean, this is the methodology. This is what it would look like. This is how you would do it. And I see that in line with your commitment to make this more useful from a policy relevant perspective, right? So it's both a methodological attempt to justify your process, right? So it's empirically grounding in some way, but also it's a how-to manual. Right. So if you had it, if a new question came up, this is what it would look like. And by the way, when you do it this way, it works, right? Or my methodology holds, right? That the processes make sense along that trajectory. But I would question how many different cases do you do it for. So the necessity of doing it for that many, because that's where you end up with your 2,000-page book, right? I also know nothing about trains, and I'm not a trained historian nor a trained historian. But I would train historian. But I would suspect, right, that multiple people have written books on this, right? So there's a book length treatment to be done there, and so if there's probably there's multiple book length treatments to be done on all of these things, and so I guess I'm also I've been reviewing too many articles recently. I'm like in a punchy illustrative case mode, like too many illustrative cases are not. You're not doing anything, right? You've given me 8 sentences on something you obviously know nothing about, right? So do it, and I could see that being useful.
I've also reviewed things like that where it's just like a series of case studies, and at the end, the people are like, "See, isn't that interesting?" I mean, I don't know. I think that I do have an intuition that some set of people will want to see it apply. But your point about it being a how-to, is absolutely critically right, and it goes to your question as well. I really do want this. So I think of like a beautiful book like Gary Marx's Windows on the Soul, which people, Mark will know this book and others will. This is a book by a person who is an STS surveillance scholar, very important in surveillance studies. Really helped drives work like Julie's that is so involved and thick and mature. But at the end of it, he just says, okay, well, what do we do with this? And he, instead of trying to tell you what to do, Gary, I think wisely, asks a series of questions and says, the better you feel about your answers to these questions, the more justified your surveillance technology is. You know what I mean? And so, and you're like, okay, well, that's interesting, you know what I mean? And so, but at the same time, and that's good. I mean, I think that anybody who's thinking about surveillance technology and surveillance in general ought to read this book, ought to ask themselves these questions. But it's not it does not make for a method. You know what I mean? And it does not make for a reproducible, standardized method that any number of kinds of people could do, versus value-sensitive design, which is a method. Right? Certain scenario planning, which is a method. I mean, there are all these.
And I think I see it as. I mean, I really do see it as a single chapter, right? I don't know if it needs to be an entire section of the book. And in some ways, if you do it well, you can weave your concepts and your methodologies through the discussion of that case to the point where it becomes a standalone. It should be standalone-ish, right? So your section 2 is all about a detailed assessment of why these are the correct steps and how to do it, and then your kind of part 3 or concluding chapter, whatever it becomes, can weave all of that in, and then one should be able to just read that chapter on trains and say, okay, well, all right, this makes sense that this is the question to ask at this stage. This makes sense that this is the scoping condition at this particular phase.
I see.
So you, in theory, right, done correctly, I think it would accomplish what you're trying to accomplish.
So that's a great metric. Can one of these applications stand alone?
Sure.
You know what I mean? That's super helpful. And it's not
Even in a separate large article, just pull it out.
Yeah,
try
I
to-
mean,
try to
or
gist
you know,
it.
yeah. I mean, or just as a book chapter to workshop.
Yeah,
You know, because I've been struggling with like, how do you workshop this
Yep.
if you're not in a very preliminary stage like I am, where you're just a proposal,
Mhm.
and you're also not all the way through with the exercise of developing it. So
Yeah.
this is a good.
And then how do you get something assigned in the class, right? I mean, so you can have an entire book assigned in the class, or you could, I mean, this is the obvious chapter that you would assign from Brian's book on
Yeah,
this
good
particular
point.
topic.
Yeah. That's a great point.
That's
so, yeah.
really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
And we just have a few minutes left, so I have a quick question. But do you want to go first?
I was just going to say a couple
Daniel?
things when you were talking that I thought of that may or may not be helpful.
Please.
Stuart Banner at UCLA has written a history on like air, the introduction of air transportation and zeppelins and airplanes and how like the legal system responded to that, mostly from like a property law perspective, who owns the sky basically. But it might be something, you know, if not an analog to the train,
Barnes
just
says that.
another data point there.
Good one. Banner, B-A-N-N-E-R.
B-A-N-N-E-R, yes, Stuart. He's a legal historian at UCLA Law.
Mhm.
And then the other thought, just kind of contemporary, if you wanted something, was like the Bloomington's struggling right now with regulating the electric scooters. And some of this is, you know, kind of touched upon a lot of the stuff you're talking about of, you know, what's the end goal for this? Is the bicycle an analog that you just, you know, all that stuff is another, you know, big current example if you wanted like a quick one to throw on there.
Yeah, they're proliferating like you wouldn't believe. I mean, I feel like they must have a reproductive capability or something like that, the way they're proliferating in Seattle. That's a great example, and I'll look up Stewart.
But you know what I heard?
Yeah.
Sidebar,
Yeah.
talking about nuclear waste.
Yeah.
That in major cities they last, or that they're about $1,200 a piece, and they last less than a month. So they wear out that quickly.
Wow.
So in major cities like Austin, they're actually replacing them on a monthly basis. But just from a
could this be
scrap
profitable?
metal, I mean, it is, somehow it is profitable.
Yeah.
But just from a scrap metal waste perspective, they're
Yeah.
they're not as environmentally
Yeah,
sound
there's
as
a
we
whole
think they are,
environmental
right?
justice aspect.
There's something that I learned from my colleague Batia Friedman about, and her work that she's been doing with Alan Boring, about just the materiality. And in fact, the graduate student who left, I mean, part of the problem with a lot of contemporary technology is that it's designed to hide its materiality, like cloud computing. You know what I mean? And therefore we don't tend to foreground, you know, considerations like how are we possibly going to deal with this Internet of Things? You know, how much compute is needed, how much cooling is needed, how much, you know, material is needed. Some of the visions for an Internet of Things like would require a second Earth that had the materials that we could extract. You know what I mean? And so I think materiality winds up being really important.
Yeah. So just a quick question, and then a few suggested, you know, citations in the spirit of looking for
Please,
governance frameworks
absolutely.
and all that.
Yeah.
And if any others have kind of final questions before we conclude here, that's great. And remember as well, for folks who need to leave, we do have pizza coming at 1 o'clock today, so feel free to dig in. So one quick question was, we talked a lot about, all right, how would a congressional staffer, you know, view this problem, or how would a state level policymaker, or maybe even at the city level? But I'm just kind of wondering to what extent you want to get into the whole self-organization aspects to this. So to what degree do you want to tee up examples of industries or even particular companies that are pioneering some of these technologies, maybe as norm entrepreneurs, maybe as not, trying to govern themselves and sometimes dismally failing. So like Angie Raymond, our data governance director, sent me this piece earlier today. I was on The Guardian today about Cambridge Analytica a year on, and they called it a lesson in institutional failure, right? And for this crowd, that's a wonderful case in point of what not to do. Maybe there's some other examples of what to do, and even some big companies like Microsoft with their Cyber Peace Institute trying to get out in front of some of this stuff. So anyway, we can maybe respond to self-governance stuff. And then just a few suggested citations for governance frameworks. So Dan Cole and Mike McGinnis here have some good stuff that they've been doing on combining a few frameworks together, like the institutional analysis and development. And then to your piece just a second ago on environmental equality, the social ecological systems framework. So it's IAD-SES, kind of combined framework. That could be an interesting way to think through the interactions between a lot of these different variables that we've been kind of talking
You
about.
said that a little too fast. The second part, social.
Oh yeah, social ecological systems. And
Ecological
I'll send you a link after we're done here, Ryan, to that one. But it's up on the Digital Library of the Commons site here, so it's easy to find. But that's a good resource, especially if you wanted to get some insights from other social sciences and apply it to some of these new areas. And then there was a special issue from the International Journal of the Commons on the SESMAD database, the Social Ecological Systems database, for basically looking at massive case studies about things like the Montreal Protocol, right? Like how useful, how well are certain international regimes working? And I'm wondering, you know, maybe some of those case studies could be interesting to dig into and apply more directly to technology, right? So how could we use insights they use, for example, the ocean design principles, and apply them to big meta issues like environmental quality and the ozone layer? But I'm wondering if there's some aspects to that could be applicable here. Like I just did a piece with Scott Bradner, who's retired from Harvard, on the Internet of Things governance and EU and US approaches, and we used the ocean design principles, which we found to be actually kind of helpful. So I just thought, you know, that could be another way to go. And the last plug on the trains thing is that we have a historian here at IU who's recently retired named Jim Madison. He did a great history of trains, and the case study that he devoted a lot of detail to is Indiana. Because in 1900, 1910, Indiana was one of the pioneers of mass transit commuter trains. We had a whole electrified system. We had a wonderful tram system in Indianapolis all set up, all of which has now been completely ripped apart. So I'm wondering, you know, as looking for policy lessons of kind of the growth and the rise of this industry, Indiana being kind of this Norm entrepreneur that's now, you know, fallen by the wayside in terms of, you know, trains and investment therein, and this whole industry disappearing as a result. I'm wondering there might be some insights there that you could glean for this project too. So I guess you do that one as well, but feel free to take up any of that you would like to.
Well, two things. I mean, first of all, thank you very much, and thanks again to everybody for participating. I really appreciate it. If you want to email me thoughts, please do. I'm just rcalo@uw.edu. Easy to find. A couple things. So first of all, I do think that a policymaker, so at the Tech Policy Lab, we think of our audience as being policymakers, like very broadly understood, to include folks, you know, at Microsoft, for example, right? And so I definitely would hope that a book like this would be the kind of thing that you might pick up as an industry leader and use to think through, you know, what your position should be and are around particular technologies. And I would hope that would be the case. We'll see. Already I have enough divergent audiences and I'm worried, but the thing about trains, so, you know, one of the things I've noticed about driverless cars is that the focus on driverless cars, even the use of the term driverless cars, does not disaggregate the technologies that are so interesting that make driverless cars possible, and thereby does not invite us to think about what our goals are in terms of getting people around safely, efficiently, and fairly, you know? But rather just assumes that we're going to continue to have this atomized world where we all have our own cars, just so we don't drive them, you know, and that they're all going to be made by private manufacturers and so on. And so, you know, recently I had occasion to respond to two very, very prominent tort professors wrote a piece about driverless car liability in Virginia Law Review. Virginia Law Review asked me to respond to it. And my response was not that their liability scheme was good or bad, but there was complete is wrong. There was a limitation in their ability to imagine precisely what automation and transportation could change about the world. They envision a world in which the authors envision, and these are two very prominent, well-known torts. They envision a world in which we just have driverless cars, but nobody drives them, and they envision a scheme whereby liability is established for individual cars of a certain kind, and it doesn't include certain kinds of damages. It doesn't include the whole vision, and they want to make it nationwide and preemptive. Okay, but the truth is that their view of how technology will come to unfold is limited, because technology can find different instantiations, and then it changes the very way people think about transportation. They're not going to own cars anymore. They're not going to buy cars necessarily. You know what I mean? And we may have now this chance to reset and think about public transportation differently, and so on. And so it does. They don't essentially view new technology, or often we don't see technology being an invitation to inventory our ends, inventory what we're trying to do, and then think about systematically about how we can accomplish those ends and what law's role in it is. You know what I mean? And so I very much will look at Jim Madison's work and highlight. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm sorry to say that we're out of time, but thank you so much again, Ryan. Remember, guys, as well, there should be pizza right back here, so feel free to grab some. And see you all again next week. Thanks for coming by. As you can tell, there's a wide array.